All right, it's 2:02 now. Let's get started. Hi there, welcome to Ask Seminar Series. This is John, Seminar Coordinator. So I will be moderating this seminar with Jennifer, our communication specialist, and also join us is our director, Nas Peter, and he will be introducing the speaker. Just so you know that this seminar is being recorded, and we will post the recording on our YouTube channel. And after the speaker's presentation, we'll have the Q&A session. So please feel free to bring up any questions you may have. And we encourage you to speak out using your mic, but you can also chat out your questions. Before the speaker gets started, I'm going to hand the ball over to our director, Nas Peter. So please, Nas, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, John, and welcome to all of you to today's Essex seminar, and a special welcome, of course, to our speaker, Kathy Pegion, from the University of Oklahoma, where she's Associate Professor and Williams Chair in Earth System Prediction. Kathy has a PhD from George Mason, and what she is working on now is mostly subseasonal to seasonal prediction of various variables. And of course, this is a very big topic as we try to, well, it would have been a big topic no matter what, but it's certainly not becoming smaller as we are trying to tackle climate change. And there are many different variables that you could focus on, but as we were just chatting about here before the seminar started, precipitation is arguably the big one. It's a big one if you're looking at meteorological disasters, because what we call meteorological disasters are most often related to water, actually. But it is a very big thing also in more vanilla or everyday terms, in terms of economic impact and food security and water security. So in addition to being really important, it's also a really, really tough problem. And it seems that you're going to tell us that there is a way forward, at least in one area of the world. And we look forward to hearing about that, and also what that might mean for the rest of the world. So with those few words of introduction, over to you, Kathy.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to present. I am going to talk about sources of predictability for subseasonal precipitation in South America. And I do want to acknowledge my co-authors, Emily Becker and Ben Kurtman, as well as acknowledge the contribution from the NCAR Earth System Prediction Working Group, as they provided some really important experiments that helped me to tease out some of these sources of predictability. So I know that most of you are probably familiar with the subseasonal timescale, but I don't like to assume everyone is. So I just want to make it clear what timescale we're looking on when we're thinking about subseasonal predictions. And it's this timescale in between our weather forecast and our seasonal outlooks. And it's usually on the order of about 2 to 4 weeks. And the reason this timescale is important and challenging is because when we think about predictability as a signal to noise problem, which is really fundamentally what it is, we're trying to find the predictable signal in a whole lot of noise. And this subseasonal timescale sort of sits in this area where the noise is large and the signal is small. So it's a very challenging prediction timescale. So I'm going to show you first temperature, because that's where we do a much better job, and just sort of sets the stage for, what precipitation will kind of look like for us. So I'm showing you here the average skill over a whole collection of hindcasts in terms of anomaly correlation for week 3 temperature hindcasts from a bunch of different models. And so you can see a bunch of different models. You can see a persistence forecast, and then this is a multi-model ensemble from all these different models. And what you can see for the most part is, although skill is not high for temperature in this time frame, there is some skill generally around the world. So there aren't too many places that have no skill. By contrast, precipitation is a big challenge, and we know that across all time scales. And That is certainly true at the subseasonal timescale. So I'm showing you here the subseasonal prediction skill from all these models at week 3, and I'm only showing you South America. And the reason I'm only showing you South America is because the entire rest of the globe is blank, as in there's no significant skill, at least on average, when you lump all months and seasons together over this large suite of hindcasts. So fundamentally, you can see that there's a region of skill in Brazil here, fairly coherent across all the models. So all the models think that there should be skill here. They're finding skill here. And so that sort of hints that the models are picking up on some sort of signal. And it's sort of important to understand why, because it's difficult to make forecasts of precipitation. It's difficult to make forecasts at this time scale. And so if we want to be able to build trust and confidence in using forecasts on these time scales, we need to be able to offer reasons for why the skill is there. So fundamentally, the question I'm going to ask and try to answer, partially answer anyway, in this presentation is, where is this skill in Brazil coming from that all of the models seem to pick up on for week 3? And to be clear, I'm showing you week 3. Often people for subseasonal timescales combine into 2-week groupings, like week 3, 4 together. But fundamentally, the skill that we see at the week 3, 4 is really only coming in week 3. The week 4 has no skill. And so I'm going to focus on this week 3 skill. So to orient you to South America and precipitation in South America, I'm showing you here the rainfall in millimeters per year from a review paper by Kai et al. And it's showing you the rainfall, and it's showing you that, of course, in general, it's wetter in the Amazon region, drier in eastern Brazil. And that just gives you an orientation of where rain typically falls kind of annually. And if you look here on the right, this is showing you for seasons, the percent of annual total precipitation from another review type paper. And you can see that the majority of precipitation in our region where we have skill is coming in December, January, February. And that is because this is the season of the South American monsoon. Associated with that is this variability of the South Atlantic convergence zone, which you can kind of see here in terms of rainfall for sort of 2 different sort of phasings of it, and the corresponding precipitation anomalies that go with that. You see this dipole pattern where, depending on where the South American convergence zone sets up, you get a wet, and then you get a corresponding dry region adjacent to it. And so this has variability on both interannual and subseasonal timescales, and it is actually the leading mode of variability of precipitation during the December, January, February season in this region. We also know that ENSO impacts precipitation in South America, typically on interannual timescales, although ENSO can project onto subseasonal timescales as well. This shows you an example from that review paper of during an El Nino, the circulation that sets up, and that circulation ultimately leads to changes in precipitation, anomalies of precipitation. And for La Nina, it's very much the similar but reversed sign. But you can see the biggest impacts seem to be not quite in the region where we tend to see our skill on subseasonal timescales, and that'll come back. So keep in mind that region, and that'll come back later as we try to understand where the skill is coming from. And then another source of predictability for precipitation in South America is the Madden-Julian oscillation. This is showing you from a paper by Grimm in Climate Dynamics. This is showing you the eastward propagation of the OLR anomalies. So the blue meaning the enhanced convection associated with the MJO, and the orange colors are showing you the suppressed convection. And so you can see that over time you get that eastward propagation of the MJO, which is a key characteristic of the MJO. And then associated with that anomalous convection is a circulation where you get where you have convection, enhanced convection, you get convergence at the surface, and then you get a rising motion and divergence aloft. And so these sort of purple and green velocity potential at 850 is showing you where you're getting convergence and divergence down low. And we can see that that also propagates eastward with the eastward propagation of the MJO convection. If you look over here near South America, what you can see is that there are also convergence and divergence circulation anomalies in South America, and those do impact the precipitation in that region. And so, for example, if you look here on the right, you can see reduced precipitation anomalies during phase 5 of the MJO. As an example, that's when the convection is located here near the maritime continent. And you can see, for example, enhanced precipitation anomalies in this region, for example, in phase 1, where you have the suppressed convection over the maritime continent. So we see evidence that the MJO is at least related to precipitation anomalies in South America. So those are a few things that can be impacting variability of precipitation in South America. So fundamentally, the question I'm going to answer today is, where is the subseasonal precipitation scale in Brazil coming from? And I'm going to look at it in terms of its time scales. Is it interannual or subseasonal primarily, where that scale is coming from? What seasons are most important for that scale? Which components of the climate system are contributing mostly to that skill, and then what mechanisms are fundamentally leading to that skill. And so I want to back up here a little and talk a little more about reforecast. I showed you some results from reforecast experiments, also called hindcast. You might see that in the literature as well. I call these time machine forecast. And so what they mean, or what they are, is I take today's model and I go back in time to a previous time and I make a forecast with today's model, not knowing not including any information from the future. I make a true and legitimate forecast of what and basically it's what forecast would we have made if we'd had today's modeling system, but back then. And I can then do that consistently across many initial conditions over many years. And since this has the forecast is already it's already happened, I can verify my hindcast against what's happened and create a set of robust statistics to understand the skill of the model. And so that's the skill that I was showing you. And so I'll come back to that skill, that anomaly correlation of precipitation for week 3 from all of these different models. And just to give you some more information about those hindcasts, most of them were initialized weekly, with the exception of the NASA model, which initializes every 5 days. Everybody ran between 32 and 45-day forecasts. And the variety of ensemble members really just depends on the modeling group and what they could provide. And then most models are 1999 to 2015, with the exception of the NCAR model here, which goes out to 2020. And I do want to highlight the NCAR model because it is basically the most skillful model of this group. And then they've also done some additional experiments. So most of what I'll show you going forward will involve the NCAR model. So I mentioned that ENSO impacts the skill, or impacts the variability of precipitation in South America. So we might want to know how much of the week 3 precipitation skill is driven by interannual variability, which would be primarily dominated by ENSO. So if I remove the interannual variability from all of these models, hindcast, and recalculate that skill, I'll go back and show you just to toggle through. And what you'll see is it's quite a few of these models, or at least some of them, all skill is lost when we remove the interannual variability, while some models retain skill when we remove the interannual variability. So to zoom in on that a little, I'm showing the CFS2 model. On the left, I'm showing you when you include interannual variability, and on the right, I'm showing you what the skill looks like when you remove interannual variability. And so in this model, the predictability here seems to be entirely driven by interannual sources, most likely ENSO. But looking at the NCAR CSM2 model, I'm showing you with interannual variability again, and then I'm removing interannual variability, and we can see that quite a bit of the skill is retained even with the interannual variability removed. We can see that much of the skill loss has to do with this region, which is consistent with the region where ENSO is known to have strong impacts in South America. So what this is telling us is that there are likely subseasonal sources of predictability. So it's not just ENSO that's giving us this skill. There's something going on at other time scales that's giving us this skill. So that leads us to the question of what is it? Next, we're going to take a quick look at the seasons so we can figure out how to focus our sort of what time of the year we should be looking at. Now, we know that the monsoon season is December, January, February. If we look at the NCAR CSM2 model and look at the skill by season, we can see that most skill is in December, January, February, and September, October, November. So I'm going to focus primarily in this presentation on DJF. Basically I will tell you that much the results are quite similar for SON. So we've looked at the time scale, we've looked at the season. Now let's see if we can understand maybe which components of the climate system are contributing most to this predictability. So is it the atmosphere, the ocean, or the land? And so to do that, I'm going to use a set of subseasonal reforecasts from that NCAR provided. I've been showing you results from the NCAR CSM, which I'm going to call the control simulate or control hindcast or reforecasts. And in that case, each component, the atmosphere, the ocean, and land, were initialized with realistic initial conditions. They have also run a set of reforecasts where they initialize certain components with climatological initial conditions and then able to see how that impacts the forecast. So for example, if they set the atmosphere initial conditions to climatology, but they properly initialize the ocean and the land, we can get a sense by comparing with the control what the role of the atmosphere's initial conditions were in that forecast skill. They've done this by setting the atmosphere to climatology, but they've also done it for the ocean and the land and every combination. So we can then compare any of these experiments with the control to understand the contribution of the initial conditions from the atmosphere, ocean, and land. And so I mentioned that the goal is to understand the contribution of each component, but it's difficult to disentangle components in a coupled system. And so we have to kind of rephrase our question or to think about what we actually can get from these experiments. So we have to actually say which components' initial conditions contribute most to predictability. And that's because even if I set the atmosphere initial conditions to climatology, I have the ocean initial conditions and the land initial conditions and some other components, the atmosphere could have been contributing to those ocean and land initial conditions. So I can't say the ocean and land weren't playing a role. I can only say that their initial conditions were critical. So I can only diagnose the role of the component's initial conditions with these experiments. So let's take a look and see the results of the skill when we look at each of these different experiments. So I'm showing you DJF skill. So now we're just focusing on the December, January, February, and I've also removed the interannual variability. So we're just looking at no interannual variability in December, January, February. And I'm showing you the control again up here in the left corner. And these are all of the additional experiments in which some component was set or some combination of components was set to climatology. And so what you'll see here is that anytime the atmosphere's initial conditions are set to climatology, any of the experiments where that happened, the skill goes to almost zero. So what that is telling us is that the atmosphere initial conditions were absolutely critical to the skill of these forecasts. And the key here is that, again, that's just the atmosphere's initial conditions. The ocean likely had influence and impact on setting up those atmosphere initial conditions. So that's not to say that the ocean or same thing with the land were not important, but that the information from the ocean and the land was already included in the atmosphere's initial conditions that were necessary to make the skillful forecast here. So now that we've identified that the atmosphere is most important, its initial conditions are most important, pointing to atmospheric, some sort of atmospheric processes, what patterns and processes were contributing to this skill? Where is it coming from? And so then I'm going to look at use canonical correlation analysis to try to identify some patterns that can help us diagnose what are the mechanisms here. And so canonical correlation analysis, similar to maximum covariance analysis, except that in this canonical correlation analysis, we're finding the time series and corresponding patterns in two data sets that are most strongly correlated, as opposed to maximum covariance analysis, where we're looking for where two time series are maximally covarying. And so then we can get them ranked by how well they correlate. And this is allowing us to decompose the skill into the most predictable patterns in time series and the least predictable patterns in time series. And so I'm showing you here on the top the most predictable pattern that comes out of this analysis. You get both a pattern for the model and the pattern for the verification. And so just to be clear, make sure I've explained this clearly, we're taking the model's week 3 forecast, we're taking the verification, or what actually happened, and we're doing this canonical correlation analysis on them to find out which patterns led to the highest correlations, or which patterns in time series together led to the highest correlations. So the most predictable pattern is this pattern here from the model and the verification, where you have dry to the north in Brazil and wet to the south. You can see that pattern is stronger in the verification, but this is an ensemble mean, so the amplitude might be muted by that, also contributing possibly to sort of the smoother representation in the model. Also combination of ensemble averaging and a coarser resolution than the verification. And then this is the second most predictable pattern, which again shows sort of a dipole of the precipitation, but shifted a little in space. And so we want to understand what physical processes are producing these patterns. And one way we can do that is to go back to our climatological initialized experiments and just look at what the correlations were for canonical correlations are for these different experiments. So what I'm showing you here in the canonical correlations, we get both patterns and time series, and I showed you the patterns in the previous slides. You get a time series for the model and the verification that go with this pattern. And the correlation between those time series is the canonical correlation. And so the correlation between those time series for the first component is about 0.5, and for the second is a little above 0.4. And these x's here, as long as they're above that x, that demonstrates that it's significantly different correlation from 0. And so this is showing you for the control. Now, if I take a climatological initialized experiment and the correlations drop to be not significant, or they drop a lot, then that tells us something about whether that pattern actually exists in this climatological initialized experiment. So if we look at this, we can see again that any of the experiments where the atmosphere was initialized as climatological, we lose those patterns. Sorry about that. We lose those canonical correlations. They drop to nearly 0. In some cases, they drop below significance. And so the key here is that, again, the canonical correlations are pointing to the role of the atmosphere. So the question further is, what are these patterns in time series? What are the mechanisms associated with them? So let's take a look a little bit more. So I talked about a little earlier, I talked about the South American dipole being the leading mode of variability in South America for precipitation. And so I'm showing you that pattern here on the top. And then I'm showing you the patterns coming from my first and second canonical correlations. And they correlate with this pattern at 0.43 and 0.24. So that's telling us that especially for the first most predictable pattern, is somewhat correlated with the South American dipole, telling us that some component of this is related to the South American dipole, but not entirely. Not all of the variance can be explained by the dipole. And if I do a difference of the dipole and the two canonical correlations, you can also see spatially that there's some other things going on besides the dipole that are contributing. So what are these other physical processes? We can diagnose those by looking at some of the other variables, other fields at the same time associated with our canonical correlation time series. And so we can regress OLR with the time series from the canonical correlation. And so this is showing you the OLR anomalies that are occurring with the regression of that with that time series. And this is simultaneous. And we can see that there are negative OLR anomalies pointing to large areas of convection in this maritime continent region, simultaneous with the canonical correlation time series. We can also go back in time, do a lagged regression, and we can see as we go back that is those OLR anomalies are pretty persistent throughout the 3 weeks, the week prior and 2 weeks prior to the time series. And so this is showing us that this area of enhanced convection is in this region is fairly persistent in space. It doesn't propagate. So it's unlikely that it's the MJO contributing to this, because the MJO characteristic of the MJO is eastward propagation, and we don't see any propagation of these OLR anomalies. The other thing I'm not showing you is I did similar lagged regressions with sea surface temperature anomalies, and I'm not showing those because the anomalies are indistinguishable from zero. So there seems to be no contribution from sea surface temperature anomalies associated with these time series either. And so then the question, what else could be going on? If we look at the circulation, I'm showing you 200 hectopascal meridional winds, doing a similar lagged correlation or lagged regression here. And you can see that there's some evidence of a wave train in this region, kind of going across the South Pacific into South America, or at least that's what it looks like. Although it's really hard to distinguish just from the regression here where this wave train is actually coming from. If we look at the second component, so that second pattern in its corresponding time series, we see some similar behavior in that we have OLR anomalies in the maritime continent region, but they are not propagating, and we do see some evidence of a wave train that across the South Pacific and into South America as well. So the next question this leads us to really is, where are these Rossby wave trains coming from? And so the next steps of this work will try to diagnose where could these be coming from. And we're going to do that with a simple atmospheric model. This is a very simple model it's nonlinear, it's baroclinic, primitive equations. It uses dry physics, very simplified dry physics. And it's a T63, so about 2 degrees with 26 vertical levels. And so you can think of this as a circa 2000 atmospheric model. And what we do is we set a background state and heating associated with a particular season. So in this case, we're going to do DJF. And the idea here is that the model is going to kind of be sort of nudged to a background state, with the idea that we're nudging it just enough so that it doesn't drift off into another world, so that we're kind of holding this DJF background state. So we're going to have the right season, but the model is allowed to have its own internal variability. So it's not being nudged so strongly that it can't vary from that background state. And then there's heating that's set up applied in this model. I'll give you more details about some of the experiments with the heating, but the key here is that we're just using climatological DJF heating in the control simulation. And so we run this model for 720 days and then drop the first 100 days. And I'm showing you here the model U200 and V200 compared with ERA 5. And the goal here is just to demonstrate to you that for a control simulation, the model has a reasonable climate such that it's still on Earth and we can do experiments with it to then understand what changes with the circulation when we impose heating in different areas. So we're going to ask the question with this model, can Rossby waves generated by heating in the regions that were identified from our CCA, can they reach South America? So if we impose heating consistent with our CCA patterns, can we get Rossby waves that reach South America that could potentially be the source of those Rossby waves that we're seeing? And so we're going to do sets of imposed heating experiments for each of those CCA components. So the most predictable component here, component 1, we had those OLR anomalies in the Indian Ocean Pacific region. And then we also have our local heating associated with the precip in South America. And so we're going to kind of do a remote heating experiment and a local heating experiment to see if we can get Rossby waves consistent with those that we saw in the CCA. And then for the second most predictable component, we have heating associated precipitation in the central equatorial Pacific, as well as the local heating associated with South American precipitation. And so I'm going to show you results from imposing heating in these regions and take a look at the Rossby wave response to those. And so in the first component, the most predictable one, I'm showing you here what happens if I were to give all of the tropical heating, so not specifying that Indian Ocean Pacific or the South America local heating, but just putting all of the heating in the tropics. And then I'm comparing that with the control simulation. So you can see that you get some Rossby wave response here from that heating throughout the tropics. So this would be an integration of waves, Rossby wave responses from heating across the entire tropics. And so it's hard to distinguish where that heating is coming from. But what you can see here is the Indian Ocean Pacific heating can produce the large majority of this response, whereas our local heating in South America cannot. So it appears that for this first component, we can get Rossby wave trains that reach South America generated by that Indian Ocean Pacific heating and not from the South American local heating. And then if we look at that second most predictable component, this is the heating where we put all the response when we put all the tropical heating in. And we can see that that Central Pacific heating does not produce much of this response at all, whereas the local heating in South America produces the largest response, more consistent with that. So most of the wave train for component 2 is explained by the local heating, while most of the heating from component 1 is explained by the remote heating in the Indian Ocean Pacific region. So to sum that up, I'm going to kind of go over the results again, just to remind you, there's a lot of details here. So the first thing we did to understand where the subseasonal precipitation scale in Brazil is coming from is we explored the timescales, and we found that it's mostly the subseasonal timescale and that the impact of the interannual timescale is very small. And then in the seasons, we identified that December, January, February, and September, October, November are the seasons with the most skill. When we diagnosed different components, found that the atmosphere initial conditions are most important, and that without them, we lose all skill. And then we tried to diagnose some mechanisms of what's happening here, and we found that it's not ENSO or the MJO that seem to be contributing mostly to this skill. There's some component of the South American dipole, which is a structure that gets set up as part of the South American monsoon system and the South Atlantic convergence zone variability. And then we found that Rossby wave trains from the Indian Ocean Pacific region, that those seem to reach South America from the this heating that we had in this region, and that is one of the key mechanism in potentially producing the precipitation skill that we have in South America. So thank you all. That's my last slide, and I'm happy to take questions. And I don't know.
Thank you so much. Oxman, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Great talk. I'm trying to understand this importance for the prosperity initial conditions. And I mean, we know that the Amazon basin was the deforestation was enormous, and we've had situations with very high temperatures, forest burnings, etc. So, I mean, imagine if you initialize the system with a climatological atmospheric condition, which is more humid than the actual we observe over a dry land. You expect to have a wrong forecast, right?
I'm not sure I understand your question, Augustine. Can you?
Okay, so due to deforestation, the atmosphere is should be much drier during the summertime there than the climatological conditions. Okay.
Oh, I see. Okay, so I think the key here is the climatological conditions are these are based on the climatological conditions from the reforecast, which were 99 to 2020. So that's what that's what climatology is being used. I'm not sure how much that is going to fully capture deforestation.
I think the big forest fire started after 2012 or 2013.
Okay.
So maybe
Yes. So I don't know that we're really capturing, I don't think the nature of these experiments are set up to really capture deforestation itself. Not that I mean, I guess that could be included somehow, but I don't know that I can speak to that.
Yeah, but if you use climatological conditions for initial atmospheric conditions, then you use wetter periods before 2020, 2012, and thus the atmosphere will be wetter than it should be.
Mhm.
So this is definitely a way to kill the predictability of the forecasting.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can really speak to the issue to that particular question. I'll have to think about
Maybe
that.
maybe separating before and after 2020, 2015, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think the goal here is to just to understand sources of skill as current skill indicates at least our current level, what we know we can predict. And so I wasn't really getting at the deforestation question. So I'm not sure that, yeah, I don't think I can really answer a question about that.
Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah. I see Tim's hand up, but I don't know if there's others, so somebody else can speak to the list of hands.
Yeah, Tim, please go ahead.
All right, thanks. Nice talk, Kathy, and nice application of CCA.
I wonder where I got that idea.
I have one quibble. I don't know if it's a quibble,
Okay.
but just a question, and then a real question. My quibble, you might say, is you call this a most predictable pattern, but it might not be the most predictable pattern in the sense of being a pattern that the model predicts well, right?
Okay.
It could be, there could be a predictable pattern in the model that's just not reflected in reality. And so then this particular approach to CCA wouldn't necessarily pick it up.
Sure.
Then the real question is, did you consider doing the CCA between the initial condition and the target to see, because since your study is about the impact of the initial condition, it would be a natural to me to try to use CCA to figure out what is that initial condition precursor. And it seems like CCA would be able to pick that out. I don't know if you thought about that.
No, great idea. Thank you. It will be next on my list. Great idea. No, I didn't do that. These actually, I started this, looking at this before these experiments existed. And then these experiments showed up and I was like, okay, I'll take a look at what they look like, right? But yeah, I think that's a good idea. Appreciate it.
I don't see any other hands, so I'm going to ask another question if I can hijack the meeting. Just another wild question here. So with your primitive equation model, I'm wondering if you have a sense of how important the background flow is. So we often use like the Gill model to understand Rossby waves and all these waves in the tropics. Do you have a sense of how important the background flow is versus how well you could predict these things from the Gill model?
Yeah, so I guess the best answer I have to that is that the background flow is clearly critical, and especially the level, the vertical level of the background flow, because I played with, I didn't talk too much about the heating profile that I used, but I played with different heating profiles of sort of how high up or how low that heating profile, and I ended up with one that's sort of a top heavy to represent, top tropical convection. But if you move that heating profile too low, then you're not in the jet level, then you basically don't get much of any response. So right, so you have to have the background flow, and it has to be matching up with where the level of the heating is. Otherwise, there's no Rossby wave response.
Oh, that's all very interesting. Thank you.
Yep.
And Augustine, I see your hand raised up again.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
sorry, I forgot to ask, what's the amplitude of the subseasonal signal in the Amazon basin?
What's the amplitude of the subseasonal signal? I'm not sure I know
In
exactly what that
precipitation.
means.
In precipitation, so the variations in precipitation at subseasonal timescales compared to seasonal variations or interannual variations, what's the relative difference?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I can answer that directly.
I mean, are we talking about 5% of the precipitation, or 2%, or 50%?
I have that, but I don't recall off the top of my head. I would say that I think the subseasonal signal was in the, 10 to 15% range.
Okay, thanks.
I think the key here with the interannual versus the subseasonal is that the space, like the location where the interannual signal is strongest is not the same as the location where the subseasonal signal is strongest. Right, that's shifted a little bit. So. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Well, if not, please feel free to interrupt me while I'm concluding. But I'd like to thank the speaker very much. And I also want to thank the attendees. And as always, so we have a virtual seminar next week given by, I think, a speaker from Chicago. So please stay tuned. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the invitation, and nice to talk with all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right.